Greetings, friends. Tonight, we open a door that was never meant to be opened. A door into the secret world of the alchemists. For centuries, these mysterious seekers labored in hidden chambers, chasing the dream of the philosopher's stone. Not to turn lead into gold, but to transform the soul itself. Join me as we descend into the candle-lit laboratories of forgotten centuries, where science, faith, and madness burn together in the same crucible.
The Secrets of the Alchemists, Part 1. They called it the magnum opus, the great work. It was a task so vast, so labyrinthine in its intricacy, that those who undertook it often returned with their eyes darkened by sleepless nights, and their hands stained with the secrets of things best left untouched. Sometimes they did not return at all. The townspeople, with their rough, practical hands and their straightforward scorn, called these men lunatics, dreamers, mad hermits hunched over cauldrons in the moonlight. The bolder ones whispered heretic and made the sign of the cross as they passed shuttered windows where, night after night, a candle guttered behind glass. Yet those who moved among the small, secretive brotherhood of the philosophers knew a different truth. In low-arched chambers lined with books in dead languages, among the clink and hiss of glass retorts, they believed, utterly and without reservation, that they were courting the divine. It was not, as the world gossiped, a matter of greedy wizards scheming to turn lead into gold. That was the outer garment, the fable for children and inquisitors. The true gold was always transformation, and not of metals alone. It was the dissolution of the self, the purification of desire, the marriage of opposites. For what difference did it make to transmute a lump of base ore if one's own soul remained heavy and unilluminated? The alchemists spoke in riddles and drew their wisdom from fable, but within every cryptic recipe and every fanged, monstrous woodcut lurked an injunction: change or be changed. It is no simple thing to seek forbidden knowledge in a world starved for wonder and ruled by fear. In these times, to be a scholar was to play a dangerous game. Latin was the language of burial and accusation, and parchment often bore testimony in blood. The flame of intellect flickered in the drafty corridors of monasteries, where a single misspoken word could see the torch snuffed out forever. And yet, there persisted, hidden among the brittle pages and the crumbling mortar, those who would not be cowed. They gathered in the light of candelabra, cloaked in secrecy, spinning circles of salt and iron to guard against what watched from the shadows. They sought not to conjure demons, but to illuminate the darkness around and within themselves. It is here, in such a world, that we find the young adept. His name was Laurentius, and he divided his days between the scriptorium of Saint-Gervais and the cool, stony cellars beneath his master's house. By daylight, he copied the glories of Horace and the riddles of Pliny for his mentor, the canon Father Grimald, a man whose tongue was as sharp as the quills he wielded. By night, Laurentius bent over battered treatises on the art of distillation, his mind drifting on fumes of vinegar and rosewater as he puzzled out the secret life of things. To his mother, he was a dutiful son and a competent enough apprentice. To Grimald, a promising vessel for the lore of a dying age. But to himself, Laurentius was nothing at all, save for a gaping, insatiable hunger. It began in the year of the comet, when the sky turned black at midday, and even the bravest townsfolk huddled in their doorways, muttering prayers to saints old as the hills. The event was taken as an omen, and as is the way of omens, it sought out the most restless souls. Laurentius spent the night of the eclipse in the library, hunched over a ciphered folio whose margins crawled with hermetic diagrams and blasphemous marginalia. The next morning, he saw the world differently. The shadows seemed deeper, the air more charged, and every stone in the cloister path throbbed with secret purpose. What Laurentius craved was not the sanctified gold of the crucifix, nor the favor of the bishop, but the power to name things and thereby remake them. He wanted to peel back the skin of the world and see what pulsed beneath. The practice of alchemy offered this promise, veiled in allegory but vivid in its implications. He haunted the market stalls for strange minerals, bribed apothecaries for scraps of mandrake and quicksilver, and listened, at the tavern, to the sailors' tales of red islands, where the birds screamed like children and the rivers ran blue as sapphire. What drew him most were the tales of transformation, the shape-shifting spirits and the men who claimed to return from death with their eyes full of fire. For Laurentius, every day was a negotiation between faith and hunger. He learned to keep his secrets well, to wear the mask of the obedient clerk while his heart pounded in the rhythm of forbidden litanies. But at night, when the candles guttered and the shadows grew thick, he summoned diagrams from memory. Circles within circles, a ladder of elements, the Ouroboros swallowing its tail. He was certain the world was not as it appeared, and if he could but find the right recipe, the right vibration of voice and matter, he could unlock the arcane machinery that spun the spheres. That winter was heavy with portents. A black goat was born in the neighboring village. The river flooded and then receded, leaving behind a rank, silvery residue that made the children sick. Even Father Grimald seemed haunted, his lectures on the fathers of the church punctuated with sudden silences and the odd, furtive glance toward the window. The town itself drew inward, its people wary of strangers and of each other. There were mutterings of plague in the port city, and more than one burning at the stake in the weeks that followed. Laurentius, meanwhile, found himself dreaming in new and terrible colors. In his sleep, he beheld a city of pure glass, latticed with veins of fire, and at its heart, a temple built entirely of mirrors. He would wake with the blood singing in his ears and the taste of ashes on his tongue. It was during this season of dread that Laurentius made the first true discovery of his life. He was in the cellar, his sanctuary, his laboratory, when it happened. He had been heating a solution of vitriol and salt, using a battered tin alembic and a flame so small it was nearly invisible. The experiment was a simple one, meant to purify a substance for later use, but when the vapor condensed, it formed a bead of liquid unlike any he had seen before. It was clear, almost oily, and refracted the candlelight with a peculiar, spectral sheen. Laurentius dipped a reed into the distillate and touched it to his tongue. It sparked, not with pain, but with memory. An image of his mother, her hands red with berry juice, the sound of Grimald's voice, reading from the Confessions, the scent of sulfur and the roar of thunder as the comet split the sky. He withdrew the reed, trembling. For a moment, everything in the cellar, the stone, the wood, his own hand, seemed alive with possibility, as though the boundaries between things had grown thin. Laurentius wept, not from fear, but from the joy of having, for a heartbeat, touched the secret pulse of the world. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he wrote furiously, filling page after page with diagrams, observations, and fragments of poetry he scarcely remembered composing. When dawn finally crept through the dust-choked window, Laurentius felt himself transformed. The world had not changed, but he had, and the task before him, the work, no longer seemed the fevered dream of madmen. It was real. It was possible. He rose from his bench, stretched his aching limbs, and turned to the battered folio that had sparked him to begin. It was then, as the first sunlight struck the page, that Laurentius saw the final, most dangerous truth. The transformation of matter was inseparable from the transformation of self, and the price of knowledge was always, in the end, the willingness to be remade. Thus began the true labor of Laurentius, and with it, the unraveling of all that he had been taught to fear. Let us go back, beyond the guttering candle in Laurentius's cell, beyond the night-stained folios and the haunted faces of small-town priests, to a world lit entirely by fire and faith, where knowledge was as much a curse as a gift. In those centuries before the printing press and the slow devaluation of the miraculous, what a man learned could kill him as surely as a knife or a pox. It was a world where the sky bled with portents, the ground exhaled devils, and even the air itself was thick with rumor and dread. The monasteries stood like islands of order in a wild ocean of ignorance, and yet even within their walls, the brave and the hungry could find only the most precarious purchase. In a cramped stone chamber near the heart of Cologne, in the middle years of the 13th century, a man named Albertus Magnus bent his great scarred hands over a crucible. To his students, he was Master Albert, a living legend who could recite both Aristotle and the Psalms without ever glancing at the page. To the more suspicious minds of the university, he was a dangerous curiosity, an experimenter with a taste for the forbidden, a man who claimed to have made artificial life and who, when pressed, would only smile and say,
"Nature is subtler than you suppose."
The Church, which had not yet quite decided whether to burn or canonize him, watched with a wary fascination, dispatching spies and confessors to document his every move. Albert's laboratory was a chaos of glass and grime, more fit for a tanner than a scholar. The walls sweated with condensation, and every flat surface was crowded with jars of strange powders, hunks of unidentifiable metal, and scrolls written in a Latin that twisted and coiled like the entrails of a sacrificial bird. By day, he lectured in the cloisters, dazzling his audiences with proofs about the movement of the heavens. By night, he hunched over charcoal burners, melting and distilling and recombining until the air grew sharp with fumes and his vision swam with afterimages. In the streets of Cologne, they whispered that Albert had conjured a man out of clay and that he kept it locked in his cellar, where it spoke in riddles and ate only roses. Some said it was the devil in disguise, others that it was Albert's soul, made manifest by some monstrous error. Albert himself never bothered to correct the rumors. He understood, better than anyone, the necessity of masks. On this particular night, as a thunderstorm threatened to tear the city from its moorings, Albert worked alone. The task was simple in principle, but maddeningly subtle in execution: to purify a sample of lead until it became almost, but not quite, gold. The most obvious method, grinding the metal to dust and boiling it in aqua fortis, yielded nothing but a grayish sludge and a sharp pain in the lungs. The real secret, if there was one, lay not in violence or brute force, but in something closer to negotiation. Albert had learned to cultivate patience, to watch the slow drift of vapors in the flask and the way the liquid shifted from indigo to violet in the presence of even the smallest impurity. He believed, as did all true alchemists, that every substance contained a seed of the divine, a buried memory of its origin. The work of the philosopher was not to overpower nature, but to coax it into revealing its own perfection. As he monitored the slow boiling of his crucible, Albert ran through in his mind the texts of the ancients, the recipe in Avicenna's Codex, the contradictory footnotes in Theophrastus, the cryptic aside in an Arabic commentary he had once copied by candlelight in a Spanish monastery. Every scrap of knowledge had been hard-won, carried across a continent in the saddlebag of some desperate refugee, or whispered at the edge of a battlefield where the laws of church and nature had momentarily collapsed. Each new attempt at transmutation was a kind of prayer, and its failure a reminder of the distance between man and God. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the chamber, casting the tools of Albert's trade into stark relief. For a moment, he glimpsed his own reflection in the polished surface of a copper alembic, a face lined by decades of obsession, eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness, and a certain unyielding hope. He wondered, not for the first time, whether the pursuit of forbidden knowledge had already marked him for destruction, or whether, as he sometimes dared to believe, it was the means by which God would save him. After all, he reasoned, if the Creator had seen fit to lace the universe with riddles, was it not the duty of the created to puzzle them out? Was curiosity a sin, or the very proof of grace? He could hear, through the storm, the sound of bells from the cathedral. It was midnight, the hour when most souls turned inward and the boundaries between worlds grew thin. In his formula-stained hands, the solution in the crucible thickened and changed, emitting an odor that was not unpleasant exactly, but which seemed to leave a metallic tang in the air. Albert leaned in, squinting through the glass. The reaction was proceeding as expected, but something about the way the vapors curled, a spiral within a spiral, a fractal repetition, reminded him of the diagrams he had once seen in a Persian treatise on the properties of the soul. He recalled the phrase, "The microcosm mirrors the macrocosm." The notion thrilled him, as it always did, and he felt a sudden kinship with all those anonymous hands that had pressed ink to parchment in the hope of deciphering the world's hidden grammar. It was in this moment of reverie that the transformation occurred. The lead at the bottom of the crucible, seasoned and battered by hours of slow heat, began to lighten. Its grayness faded, gave way to a subtle, lambent glow that seemed to pulse with every stroke of the lightning outside. Albert held his breath, watching as the dross separated, the impurities sloughed away, leaving behind a bead of something impossibly pure. Not quite gold, he was too honest or too cautious to call it that, but gold's closest cousin, as if the metal had dreamed of divinity and come back merely sanctified. He fished out the bead with a pair of iron tongs, cradling it in his palm, as one might a drop of molten sunlight. He felt, not triumph, but awe, a kind of vertigo at the edge of the possible. For a while he simply stared at the thing, letting the implications settle in. It was not, he realized, about wealth or even about power. The transmutation was a metaphor, a sign that matter itself yearned for perfection, that the lowliest element could be exalted by suffering and time. He thought of his students, the ones with ink on their fingers and laughter always lurking beneath their solemn vows. He thought of the church, with its bans and inquisitions, and its simultaneous, unspoken reliance on the very scholars it condemned. He thought finally of his own soul, battered by years of doubt and longing, and wondered what it might look like if ever it could be refined. There was a knock at the door, soft but insistent. Albert wrapped the bead in a scrap of cloth and set it on the table, then wiped his hands on his robe. He opened the door to find a young novice, pale and breathless from the climb up the cold stone steps.
Master,
the boy whispered.
the bishop is awake again. He asks for you.
Albert nodded, gathering up his notes and the cloth-wrapped miracle. He would answer the summons, as always. But as he followed the novice down the spiral corridor, he pressed the bead tight in his fist, feeling its improbable warmth. He thought, with a quiet amusement, that every bishop in the world would kill to hold such a thing, to know that the ancient promises were not all mockery. He thought, too, that the only true heresy was despair. This, then, was the essence of the alchemist's creed. Not greed, but ascent. The transformation of matter was only the beginning. The real quest was to refine the self, to burn away the dross of ignorance and fear, and emerge at last, worthy of the world that had made you. Gold, after all, was valuable only for what it could purchase, and the true currency of the philosopher was wonder. In such a world, every experiment was a prayer, and every failure a lesson written in the ink of humility. The alchemist's furnace was not a place of damnation, but a crucible of becoming, a place where, if one was very lucky, a man might catch a glimpse of the divine blueprint, and in so doing, learn something vital about his own design. But above all else, the true work was allegory. Its real subject was not silver or quicksilver, but the human soul. The base material was the self, the crucible, suffering. The outcome, if one survived the ordeal, was not gold, but wisdom. Every retort, every experiment, every sleepless night was a metaphor for the ancient hope that, by understanding the world, one might finally understand oneself. It was an idea that would haunt Laurentius for the rest of his brief and brilliant life. The alchemist's laboratory, built in the shadowy flank of the monastery's east wing, was part cathedral, part madhouse. The room itself seemed to warp the very air around it, as if the laws of nature could be bent by the density of intention within those four soot-stained walls. The shelves were laden with books, many so ancient that their bindings had warped into permanent hunched postures, their spines inscribed not with titles, but with sigils and ciphers that only the properly initiated could begin to decipher. There were books in Latin and Greek, but also in Arabic, Hebrew, and the even more obscure tongues of the old heretics, all stacked together in uneasy truce. Every available surface was crowded with tools of the trade, retorts and crucibles, battered by years of fire, glass tubes coiled like the intestines of saints, mortars that had ground everything from angelic salts to the desiccated hearts of crows. Strange smells layered themselves in the air, so that to breathe was to taste the history of the place, the sharp sweetness of ether, the reek of sulfur, the oddly comforting toastiness of calcined bone. At any hour, some permutation of elements was underway, and always in the background was the slow, almost musical rhythm of transformation, a drip, a hiss, a subtle shifting of colors that made the humble act of wading into a kind of religious devotion. To modern eyes, the operation might have seemed like a rough draft of chemistry, a blundering toward the periodic table by way of superstition and trial. But for those who worked in it, the laboratory was a living microcosm of the universe, a place where matter could be coaxed into revealing its secret hierarchies and the intentions of its creator. Every change in state, every foaming reaction or sedimentation was a choreography that mirrored the great acts of Genesis. When the master purified mercury, he purified himself. When he separated the constituent parts of salt or sulfur, he drew up a diagram of the soul and its tripartite divisions. The act of recombining these substances, of balancing their natures so that neither overwhelmed the other, was a rehearsal for the final alchemy, the redemption of the fallen world, the repair of the rift between earth and heaven. The rituals of the laboratory were nearly liturgical. Each day began with the recitation of formulae, sometimes spoken, more often muttered under the breath, meant to align the intentions of the alchemist with the sympathies of the materials. There were gestures, too, and small superstitions. 3 turns of the pestle, always to the right, a pinch of dust from the floor, added to every mixture to remind the operator of his own mortality. These habits, passed from master to apprentice, acquired the weight of scripture. It was said in the cloisters that the master once spent an entire month refusing to perform a single experiment until the laboratory had been properly exorcised by a Dominican friar whose specialty was the banishment of elemental spirits. The memory of that waiting, the tension between impatience and awe, had never quite left Laurentius. Laurentius, who was then only a youth, had watched from the shadows as the master performed his work. At first he was swept up by the practicalities, the neatness with which the glass tubes fit together, the way a single drop of oil could send a solution roiling, the almost mathematical precision of the measurements. But as months passed, he began to glimpse the allegory beneath the surface. The master did not merely seek to make gold from lesser metals. He sought to make gold from himself, to burn away every trace of darkness and contradiction. This was the true goal of the great work, the part that could never be written down in any book, no matter how cleverly encrypted. It was not, Laurentius realized, about the making of matter at all, but about the making of men. He learned to read the signs in small things, the way the master's grin would sharpen when an experiment failed, as if every disaster brought him closer to the core of the mystery. The silent prayers offered over a particularly stubborn solution, the way the high, clear note of success would ring through the stone corridors, only to be followed by a long, thoughtful silence. Laurentius came to believe, as the master did, that the universe was a puzzle box built to be solved. Every question that could be asked was a message from God, and every answer, no matter how tentative, was a step toward communion. For Laurentius, the laboratory became a sanctuary from the storm of his own doubts. He would creep back after curfew, lighting a single candle so as not to wake the dead or the living, and leaf through the thickest of the codices, his fingers stained with ink and the occasional hot splash of acid. In these moments, he felt himself transformed, not into a philosopher or a saint exactly, but into something more essential. A seeker, a question posed to the world, waiting in hope for a reply. It was an idea that would haunt Laurentius for the rest of his brief and brilliant life. In the East, centuries before the word alchemy congealed in Latin, the Chinese seekers of Tao, hermits, sages, and the less pious frauds, had already begun their pursuit of the elixir of immortality. They built their crucibles not in monasteries, but in mountain caves wreathed in pine smoke and legend, where immortal cranes and poisonous mushrooms grew side by side. Their eyes were fixed not on gold, but on the pale, unaging faces of the ancient immortals who haunted every folk tale. If they could just align the breath of the body with the pulses of earth and sky, if they could just find the right balance of yin and yang, they would step off the wheel of decay forever. They drank tinctures of mercury and arsenic, boiled cinnabar into syrupy reduction, and suffered, if they were unlucky, a radiant, agonizing death that at least startled the next generation into new refinements. The Taoists were not naive chemists, though the annals of their failures could fill a library. They mapped the body as a lattice of rivers and steams, a castle with secret stairways and treasure rooms. They invented gunpowder by accident, seeking not destruction, but a shortcut to heaven. The first firework was not a weapon, but an offering to the gods, proof that matter itself could be made to leap the bounds of nature. When the Great Flood destroyed their libraries, and when the emperors banned the quest for immortality, on the grounds that it worked too well, and thus threatened the dynastic order, the Taoists simply went underground. They preserved their knowledge in the form of allegories, so that a recipe for a life-extending pill could be read as a metaphor for patience, or as a guide to perfecting one's calligraphy, or as an instruction for surviving a corrupt court. Every secret was a palimpsest, and every master a blend of shaman, scientist, and poet. The true Taoist could turn lead into gold, or at least trick the emperor into thinking so, and thereby buy enough time to complete the real work, the transformation of the self. Farther west, in the Arab world, the art reached its first true scientist in the figure of Jabir ibn Hayyan, the man the Latins would call Geber. He wrote not one treatise, but hundreds, a deluge of arcana that swamped the libraries of Baghdad and Alexandria, and centuries later, the monasteries of Europe. Jabir saw in matter not just the whim of capricious gods or the illusion of Maya, but a set of underlying laws. Everything was made from four essential qualities: heat and cold, moisture and dryness, just as every word in Arabic could be distilled to a root. God was not absent from his equations, but rather the master of the laboratory, the ultimate architect whose intentions could be glimpsed by the patient and the pious. To enter Jabir's workshop was to inhale a world of conflicting aromas: the smoky bite of sulfur, the numbing chill of camphor, the honeyed rot of fermentation. He invented the alembic, the first true still, and from it coaxed perfumes, acids, and the kind of concentrated spirits that would later animate Europe's experiments and Europe's drunks. He believed, as did the Sufis, that the universe was a series of veils, and that every experiment was a lifting of one thin curtain. To transmute lead into gold was, for Jabir, a symbol of the soul's pilgrimage from ignorance to illumination. He loved paradoxes, and often wrote in code, lest his enemies, and there were always enemies, use his findings for base or violent ends. He was as much a mystic as a chemist, and in his eyes the boundaries between the two dissolved like salt in warm rain. The Arab alchemists, more than any before them, understood that the path of knowledge was littered with bodies. They told stories of rival scholars poisoned by mercury fumes, of manuscripts that drove men mad, of apprentices who vanished into the deserts, never to be seen again. They also pioneered the idea of the secret circle, a cabal of initiates who alone could be trusted with the philosopher's stone, and who guarded it with a loyalty deeper than blood. It was said that the last words of a dying alchemist were always a riddle, and that the one who solved it would inherit not just his notes, but his most dangerous hopes. When Europe finally rediscovered these texts, pried from the wreckage of Toledo or smuggled in citron crates up the boot of Italy, it was like the sudden rousing of a feverish sleeper. The libraries of Christendom, for centuries starved of wonder, were abruptly flooded with the possibility that the ancient promises were not all lies. The monasteries at first resisted, then succumbed, and finally became the most fanatical curators of forbidden curiosity. For every monk who denounced the alchemists as heretics, 10 more memorized their recipes by candlelight and hid the best volumes behind false walls. The inquisitors could burn the books, but they could not quench the burning in the minds of those who read them. And so the Western dream of the philosopher's stone was born, not as a scientific project, nor as a spiritual discipline, but as a feverish synthesis of both. It was a hope that refused to die, and it spread not only in the cloisters, but in the universities, the courts, and even the dark markets of the cities. By Laurentius's time, the true secrets had already been diluted 1,000-fold, and yet the hunger for them was stronger than ever. The laboratories of Paris, Prague, and Salamanca were filled with men who fancied themselves heirs to Jabir and the Taoists, but who more often succeeded only in blowing themselves up or poisoning their neighbors. Still, for every charlatan or lunatic, there was one who glimpsed, if only for an hour, the possibility of a deeper order. In the endless dusk of the laboratory, with its stained walls and its steady drip of condensation, Laurentius became the sum of all his masters, the living residue of centuries' worth of failed experiments and impossible dreams. The true inheritance of the ancient seekers was not a single formula or substance, but a way of inhabiting the world, a habit of looking at every dark, stubborn limit and seeing there not a wall, but the outline of a door. Matter, to Laurentius, was never silent. It was always on the verge of speech, gases threatening to bubble over, metals straining against their ores, crystals yearning for the symmetry that they found only in the mind of God. The world was not finished. It was a scaffolding, a half-built cathedral trembling with potential. Every element was unfinished, every soul an amalgam, every page of the books only an introduction to the next unwritten chapter. He liked to imagine the old Chinese sages in their mountain caves, sipping mercury and arguing the relative merits of mushrooms and jade. He pictured Jabir ibn Hayyan writing his endless treatises by lamplight, the air puckered with the tang of vinegar and sulfur, his pen racing to outpace the encroaching dark. He even spared a grudging admiration for the perfumed charlatans of Paris and Prague, who had perhaps never touched the stone, but who could at least conjure the illusion of progress, and thus keep the hope alive for another generation. Laurentius's own days followed a choreography so precise that it bordered on the superstitious. He would rise before dawn, light the lamp with a prayer to the patron saint of lost causes, and begin the morning with a review of the last night's disasters. Glass flasks blackened with soot, blisters blooming along the fingers, the unmistakable taste of failure. Yet each failure was not an end, but a necessary stage, the first decomposition before the appearance of something new. He grew to love the darkness of the Negredo, that first stage of the magnum opus. Most apprentices feared it. The rot, the stench, the way that matter seemed to collapse into itself, as if the world's secret aim was self-annihilation. Laurentius saw in that darkness the echo of his own doubts, the raw material of every confession he had never made. He would stand over the iron crucible and watch the blackening of the mixture, the slow birth of a formless ooze, and feel a strange kinship with its misery. It was a comfort to know that even the most refined substances began like this, in the denial of their own natures. He kept a diary of these transformations, his own book of shadows, and wrote in it the way a dying man might address a letter to God, not in hope of reply, but in the belief that the act of writing was itself a form of prayer. Negredo, he wrote, is not the end, but a ruthless kindness. It strips away illusion, mercy, and leaves only the thing itself waiting to be changed. The second stage, albedo, was a kind of resurrection. The residue left by the first putrefaction was brittle, almost weightless, but it could be coaxed into new clarity with the right combination of fire and air. Laurentius learned to recognize the exact moment when the sludge in the retort gave way to ash, and then to a powder so white it seemed to glow from within. He thought of it as a kind of forgiveness, a washing clean, and he sometimes wept to see the colorless bloom at the bottom of the flask. It was here that the old superstitions crept back. The insistence that a single hair or a stray mote of dust could sabotage the entire process, that the operator's thoughts could influence the outcome, that the purity of the product depended on the purity of the seeker. Laurentius began to fast before the experiments, to scour his hands until they bled, to confess his minor impieties to the skeleton in the corner of the storeroom, whose bony face seemed always to smile at his self-recrimination. It was during one of these bouts of purification, after a week of sleeplessness and fasts broken only by the sour dregs of wine, that he experienced the first true sign. The solution he had prepared, a mixture of saltpeter and antimony, teased with a breath of sulfur, did not behave as expected. Instead of drying to a dull crust, it effloresced. Thin, radiant needles shot outward from a central point, weaving a lattice so intricate it seemed to mock the clumsy geometry of the flask. Laurentius stared, transfixed, as the needles grew by the hour, rearranging themselves into shapes he could not name. He fancied he saw among them the forms of letters, the fragments of a coded message, a latticework of meaning hidden in the mineral's heart. For days he did nothing but watch, his hunger forgotten, his mind emptied of all but this single, inhuman intelligence unfolding before his eyes. He tried to tell the master, but the master only smiled his thin smile and reminded Laurentius of the rule against pride. No discovery, he said, was ever made for the first time. There was always someone who had gone before, and who had left behind a riddle instead of an answer. Laurentius retreated, chastened, but the memory of the crystalline message haunted him. He began to collect the failed attempts, the malformed stones and poisonous residues, and arranged them on the windowsill above his cot. In the moonlight, the little collection glimmered and sparkled, as if mocking the poverty of the cell and the poverty of his own understanding. He took it as a sign that every effort, no matter how abortive, contributed to a larger design. The failures were not only preparatory, they were themselves the work. By the time he reached the third stage, Citrinitas, Laurentius had begun to see the transformations everywhere. Not just in the laboratory, but in the city outside, in the fevered movements of the market, in the way rumors spread along the students' quarter like wildfire, devouring and transmuting all sense. To enter the city was to witness a perpetual experiment. Hierarchies melting and re-solidifying, fortunes dissolved in a single night, entire reputations reduced to dross and then reconstituted as legend, if they were lucky. Laurentius came to understand that the yellowing of the mixture, its gradual, almost imperceptible shift from deathly white to a color reminiscent of bile or butter or sunlight at noon, was a metaphor for the slow, contagious spread of knowledge itself. The new idea always began as a contaminant, a bit of impurity, a dangerous and ungovernable spark. Only with time and patience could it be reconciled to the structure of the old, and only then by a kind of violence that left scars on both the host and the invader. He saw himself as both, the vandal and the defender, the innovator and the priest of tradition. Every night he would sneak into the library, past the snoring monks and the sentries who were paid more to look away than to pursue, and seek out the books that were meant to be forbidden. He copied passages by candlelight, hiding the leaves in his boots, and read them out loud to the pigeons on the roof under cover of darkness. The city was alive with secrets. In the taverns, Students debated whether the devil himself had written some of the treatises smuggled in from the East. In the cathedral, priests thundered that every alchemist was a would-be god, and that every attempt to transmute was a blasphemy against the fixed order of creation. Laurentius listened to both sides, but trusted neither. He had seen the world's fixed order and found it wanting. Rubedo, the final stage, was said to be the rarest and the most dangerous. To reach it was to risk madness or worse, the transformation of the soul into something unrecognizable, monstrous, or divine. The old masters wrote of it only in riddles and allegories. It was not a color so much as a condition, a state of being at once solid and on fire. Laurentius obsessed over the descriptions, searching in every experiment for the first hint of redness. A blush in the flask, a smoldering edge to the residue, a drop of blood accidentally spilled in the course of the work. He wondered if the stories of spontaneous combustion, of monks gone mad and running naked through the halls with their skin aflame, were just metaphors, or warnings, or glimpses of a truth too scalding for the tongue to pronounce. He dreamed of that redness. In sleep, he saw the city ablaze, its stone towers softened to wax, its rivers running molten under a sky the color of wine and wounds. He dreamed of himself, too, or rather a version of himself that had survived the ordeal. Hair grown long, eyes gone wolfish, skin scribed with the secret alphabets of the elements. In the dream, he did not wake, but simply passed from one world into another, as if the boundary between lead and gold, between flesh and spirit, had been dissolved forever. He woke from these dreams with a hunger that nothing in the world could satisfy. Not food, not drink, not the small comforts of the flesh or the fleeting victories of the laboratory bench. He would stumble from his cot at dawn, the taste of iron and ashes still on his tongue, and find himself seized by an animal yearning that left him shaking. His hands trembled even before he touched the crucibles. His heart pounded as if trying to flee the confines of his chest. He tried, in the early weeks of these feverish awakenings, to subdue himself by force of will. He doubled his fasts, redoubled his prayers, flogged himself with a willow switch borrowed from the gardener's shed. Yet nothing dulled the hunger, nothing satisfied. He knew that the work was killing him, or remaking him, or both, and that he was powerless to resist. There was a comfort in the inevitability of it, the sense that his life was no longer his own, but a kind of slow combustion, an experiment in which he played the part of both reagent and victim. The final stage, rubedo, had always been described as a union of opposites, a marriage of fire and stone. Laurentius could not help but imagine it as a kind of dying, a microcosm of the world's own promised apocalypse, in which the hard and the mutable, the body and the soul, were finally fused by catastrophe. The old masters wrote that the philosopher's stone was neither solid nor liquid, neither red nor gold, but both, an impossible amalgam. Some claimed it was a powder, some a crystalline bead, some an oil that burned without being consumed. Laurentius, reading these accounts by candlelight, wondered whether the stone truly existed, or whether it was only a myth to justify the suffering that preceded it. What if the magnum opus was not a process, but a wound, an emptiness that could never be filled, a hunger that could never be sated? He began to read not only the texts endorsed by the master, but also the ones forbidden to students. Crumbling pamphlets bound in human skin, pamphlets written in a cipher that seemed to rearrange itself with every reading. He devoured stories of the ones who had failed, the suicides, the murderers, the exiles who wandered from one city to the next, leaving behind only the faintest trail of rumors before vanishing altogether. He found the stories more compelling than the formulas. There was a perverse solace in knowing that he was not alone, that the hunger which drove him had destroyed countless others before him, and would destroy countless more. It was, he reflected, the one thing that could not be transmuted, the basic, unyielding appetite for something more. He began to suspect that the master had once suffered the same obsession, and that his sternness was a kind of armor against the memory. Sometimes, late at night, Laurentius would pass the master's cell and hear the old man muttering in his sleep, speaking in tongues, or weeping into the sleeves of his robe. Once, Laurentius caught him standing in the garden at midnight, staring up at the blood moon with an expression so nakedly terrified that Laurentius pretended not to see. He wondered if the master, too, had been visited by dreams of fire, or whether he had simply been broken by the endless succession of failures and declared peace with the world as it was. Laurentius could not imagine surrendering so completely. The hunger would not permit it. He began to keep 2 diaries. One he showed to the master, filled with careful notes and modest conclusions, every page calculated to display humility and steady progress. The other he hid behind the loose stone in the wall by his cot, and in it he recorded the dreams, the terrors, the theories so outlandish he dared not speak them aloud. He wrote of the possibility that the stone was not a physical substance at all, but a form of language, a sentence or incantation so perfect that it could rearrange the fabric of reality. He wrote of the heretical idea that maybe every alchemist was the philosopher's stone, that the search was only a pretext for the transformation of the seeker. He wrote of the moment he realized that his own mind was being transmuted, grain by grain, into something harder and more brilliant than the person he had once been. In those weeks, Laurentius ceased to eat except when commanded. He wandered the city at night, watching the flicker of torches on the rooftops, the way the moonlight gilded the gutters and trash heaps with the same indifference it bestowed upon the grand cathedral. He heard street preachers prophesy the end of the world, and he believed them. He saw a rat devour its own young in a cellar, and felt, absurdly, a kinship with its desperate logic. In the laboratory, his hands became steadier even as the rest of his body frayed. He could measure out a dram of mercury so precisely that the scales barely quivered, could draw a vacuum in the apparatus until the glass threatened to implode. Yet nothing he produced satisfied him, not even the discoveries that would have made a lesser apprentice famous. The hunger grew and grew until he began to wonder whether the process would end with his matter dissolving entirely, leaving behind only a little heap of ash and a legend. The true stone, so far as he could guess, was not an object but a story that took root in the mind and grew until it possessed the entire body, an infection that spread through cults, brotherhoods, and dynasties, always promising that with just one more trial, one more night of suffering, the secret would at last be revealed. Laurentius was sure now that he was dying. Whether he would be reborn or simply erased, he could not say. But he wrote in his secret diary every night, leaving a record in case anyone else should ever follow the same path. And in the writing, there was a kind of peace, a sense of having done what was required by the logic of the world. There were always casualties. The annals of the science, if it was a science, not a kind of sanctioned madness, were full of names that had simply disappeared, as if the act of seeking had erased them, not only from the ledgers, but also from the world itself. Some lost their minds with a kind of theatrical flourish. There was the story of Filarete, the Venetian, who after working for 20 days and 20 nights without sleep, emerged from his cell clad in nothing but flaking gold leaf, demanding to be crowned emperor by the city watch. He was last seen wading into the lagoon, shouting hexameters at the moon. Others lost their faith more quietly, like Brother Hieronymo, who after a decade of fasting and retort polishing, simply stopped believing in the existence of God, and then in the existence of anything at all. He spent his final years in a tavern, playing dice with salt miners, a lump of lead dangling around his neck as a kind of personal memento mori. But for most, the cost was the body, a slow corrosion of the nerves, the lungs, the liver, until the seeker was left a shuddering husk, not quite alive and not quite dead. Yet even this was preferable to the fate of those who succeeded. The rare few who were said to have completed the work did not become rich or famous or even wise. They vanished. Sometimes literally, sometimes through the obliteration of rumor. Laurentius kept a catalogue of their stories, half as a warning and half as a prayer. There was the monk in Prague who, during the siege, transmuted a cathedral's iron into silver to pay for the city's ransom, only to be found the next morning. His body collapsed in the shape of a rose, blood and metal pooling around him in equal measure. There was the wandering scholar from France who arrived in Padua with a casket of red powder and left, weeks later, in a procession of silent men who moved only at night. The casket was never seen again, and always there was the tale of the Brotherhood, a shifting cabal who met under the gibbous moon, exchanging codes and riddles, swearing themselves to secrecy and, if necessary, to murder. Sometimes Laurentius wondered if he had ever met a member of the Brotherhood in the city's labyrinthine alleys, or if he was being watched by them even now, his progress noted in a ledger somewhere beneath the streets. He found himself scrutinizing the faces of strangers, searching for the telltale signs, pupils too bright, gestures too deliberate, the hint of a chemical burn under the cuff of a sleeve. The prospect did not frighten him. If anything, it made the city feel more alive. There were others like him. The knowledge was both a comfort and a spur. All this, he wrote in his hidden diary, was proof that the world of alchemy was a kind of mirror, reflecting both the highest aspirations and the deepest derangements of those who gazed into it. The furnaces burned with a light that was, at its core, indistinguishable from desire, a longing to push past the boundary, to see what lay beyond the limits of the flesh. The failures, too, were luminous in their way. The city's air was thick with the residue of 10,000 failed experiments, but also with the stories of those who had dared and burned and left behind a legend. Laurentius read these stories with the same reverence others reserved for Scripture. It was a litany of suffering, yes, but also of hope. He sometimes caught himself smiling at the old symbols: salt, sulfur, mercury. They were not just substances, but metaphors for the conflicting elements inside himself. The dragon devouring its tail, the lion swallowing the sun, the phoenix rising from ashes. These were not mere decorations in the margins of a folio, but the only truly honest language for what was happening to him. The process was not about gold, or even knowledge, but about the transformation of the seeker. Alchemy was an art of self-immolation, and the goal was not a thing to be possessed, but a state to be endured. Were the great alchemists deceivers or visionaries? Laurentius found the distinction more and more meaningless the further he went. To believe in the possibility of transmutation was to believe that the order of the world was not fixed, that everything, even the most base, could become something else. It was a heresy so profound that it could only be spoken in riddles, and only by those who were prepared to pay the price. So he kept working, even as the city changed around him. He watched the students in the tavern as their arguments graduated from philosophy to blood feuds, watched the priests on the cathedral steps as their sermons grew louder and more desperate. He saw the master's hands, once sure and delicate, begin to tremble, saw the pigeons on the roof mutate from a hobby into a private obsession, their cages multiplying with every passing month. He saw a world on the brink of combustion and took solace in knowing that his own furnace was not the only one. At night, he dreamed of fire. Sometimes the fire was inside him, consuming every last ounce of flesh and leaving nothing but a skeleton of glass. Sometimes it was outside, catching in the alleys, climbing the cathedral walls, turning the whole city red as a wound. He would wake gasping, heart pounding, unsure for a moment whether he was alive or some kind of chimera, a monster born in the laboratory of his own mind. He began to wonder if the final stage, the rubedo, was not something that happened in the crucible at all, but only in the soul, a condition of such intolerable intensity that it could not be survived except in legend. The secret texts hinted at this. They spoke of a fire that could not be quenched by any earthly means, a redness that was less a color than a revelation, a state of being that was neither human nor divine, but something altogether new. He tried to write about it, but the words slipped away, leaving only symbols that made sense only to him. He filled the margins of his diary with drawings, circles within circles, ladders made of fire, the faces of animals that looked oddly like his own. He knew he was losing himself, piece by piece, and that there was no way back. But he also knew that this was what he had wanted all along. The city was full of men who lived and died without ever being transformed by anything. Laurentius, in his fever, considered himself lucky to be among the damned. He read once that the arcanum, the ultimate secret, could not be spoken, only enacted, that it was a performance, not a possession. He wondered if this was why every true alchemist ended in silence, or madness, or flames. He wondered if this was why the Brotherhood killed its own, or why the most brilliant minds found themselves drawn not to the creation of gold, but to the unmaking of the self. The thought did not frighten him. It was almost a relief to imagine his own dissolution as part of some larger pattern, a cosmic joke that only the initiated could enjoy. He resolved then to pursue the work to its end, whatever that might be. No half measures, no retreat. He wrote the decision in his secret diary, and the act of writing made it real. His hand was steady as he finished the sentence, even though the rest of him trembled. The world outside was growing colder, and the nights longer. But inside the laboratory, there was always the promise of fire. He wondered, as he stared into the flame, whether the old stories were true, whether someone, somewhere, had really accomplished it, changed not just matter, but the fundamental nature of the world itself, whether the Brotherhood still met under the moon, guarding a secret too dangerous to reveal. He decided that it didn't matter. He would find out for himself, one way or another. The Secrets of the Alchemists, Part 2. Centuries turned as slow as a pestle grinding bone, but the fire refused to die. It flickered in the ink-dark cubicles of monasteries, where quills scratched at midnight, and the only music was the slow drip of distilled condensation. It whispered in the echoing chambers of royal courts, where advisors traded poisons and philosophers traded paradoxes, and the king's favor could turn on a single golden promise. It smoldered in the crooked, unswept towers on the periphery of every city, where solitary men and women, most of them half mad with the long years, spent their waking hours peering through colored glass at the stars, searching for order, for pattern, for perfection in a universe that offered none. The world changed. Gods toppled, empires burned, the continents themselves buckled and cracked, but the small flame of alchemy burned as steady as the sun behind the clouds. By the time the 14th century rolled around, the old discipline had mutated into something more dangerous. What had once been the province of theologians and ascetics was now the obsession of kings, bishops, courtesans, mountebanks, quacks, and spies. It was both legend and mania, a fever that moved from the cloister to the marketplace to the throne room, always promising the same impossible thing: the transformation of base matter, the distillation of spirit from mud. The kings of Europe whispered about it in their hunting lodges and hunting beds, commissioning secret labs staffed by the most brilliant failures of the age. The children of goldsmiths and jewelers forged manuscripts every bit as beautiful as the relics they claimed to describe, passing off their glittering fables for coin and cocaine. Even the church, which had always insisted on the purity of its own mysteries, found itself in a double bind. Alchemy was heresy, yes, but it was also a kind of hope, a dangerous rival to the resurrection itself. The air of the time was thick with rumor, thick with incense, thick with the scent of burning flesh and the desperate reek of chemicals boiled past their limit. It was a world where science and sorcery spoke the same language, where the line between a chemical equation and a demonic summoning was so fine it could only be drawn in blood. And in that twilight, where every advance in knowledge was shadowed by a threat, and every failure carried the scent of damnation, certain names began to glow like embers, and sometimes like the last stars in an exhausted sky. Laurentius knew these names by heart. He had copied them out in the margins of his secret diary, tracing their lineages across the centuries as if they were saints or serial killers. Some were frauds, some were martyrs. Some were stories that never happened, and some were stories that happened so many times that history had no choice but to forget them. He imagined them all gathered in a single infinite laboratory, a symposium of the damned, working together in a silence broken only by the soft ticking of the cosmos. At the head of this ghostly table, always, was Nicholas Flamel. Flamel, the name itself sounded like a joke, a tongue of flame, a candle burned at both ends. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable man, a Parisian bookseller, modest and precise, whose shop on the Rue de Marivaux was more famous for its cheapness than its erudition. He had a wife, Perenelle, whose reputation for charity and for gossip nearly outshone his own. They had no children. They kept a rose garden, a dog, and according to the neighbors, a cellar full of odd-smelling jars. The legend said that Flamel had, one icy morning, come into possession of an ancient manuscript, a book so old it was written not in Latin or Greek or even the devil's Hebrew, but in a pictographic code that fell somewhere between Egyptian hieroglyphs and the doodles of the blind. The book, or so the story ran, contained the secret of the philosopher's stone, the vessel of immortality, the key to all transformation, the holy grail of every seeker from Zosimos to Avicenna to the present day. The story fascinated Laurentius for its almost surgical precision. Flamel was not a magician, nor a showman, nor a man given to visions. He was, by every account, a clerk. The legend said he spent 20 years parsing the book's secrets, piecing together its logic with a patience so methodical it bordered on the subhuman. He bought jars and crucibles from the apothecaries along the Seine. He hired the occasional itinerant scholar to translate a passage or repair a page. The neighbors watched him grow thinner, paler, less and less like a man who ate or slept, or even breathed. In time, his shop began to thrive in ways that defied explanation. Where once he had struggled to sell a single prayer book, now he seemed to possess an endless supply of rare tomes, which he resold at prices even the nobility found suspiciously low. He and Perenelle moved to a better house. They hosted feasts for the poor and repaired the roofs of half the parish. Inevitably, tongues began to wag. It was said that Flamel had not only discovered the stone, but had used it, that he could transform base metals into gold, and that he had made not just himself, but Perenelle immortal. The pair were seen, it was said, walking the streets of Paris long after their official deaths, both of them younger than they had looked in life. Some claimed to have glimpsed them in Spain, in Prague, in Morocco. Others said they had been recruited by the papal court or by the Brotherhood, and were now the secret patrons of every alchemist in Europe. Laurentius loved the story because it made perfect sense. The most dangerous secrets were always hidden in plain sight. The greatest magus of the age was not an emperor or an assassin, but a mild-mannered bookseller who simply did the work, page by page, day after day, until the line between myth and history quietly dissolved. The evidence, as always, was ambiguous. Flamel's grave was emptied, and some said the body inside was not his, or that it had been swapped for a wax effigy, or that there had never been a body at all. The church exhumed his papers, but found nothing more suspicious than a few books on mathematics and a single, heavily annotated copy of the Mysterium Magnum. No proof was ever found. But the story endured, because every age needed its magus, its immortal wanderer who had seen the truth, and Flamel fit the bill so neatly that it hardly mattered whether he had ever lived at all. Laurentius was not so different from Flamel, he realized, except that his own manuscript was not a book, but the city itself, a living, breathing palimpsest, layered with centuries of failed experiments and impossible hopes. He moved among its alleys as Flamel had moved among his bookshelves, collecting fragments, piecing together the logic of the world one riddle at a time. He too found himself growing thinner, less human, more transparent in the eyes of others, as if the city was slowly rewriting his body in the margin notes of history. But Flamel was only the beginning. For every legend that ended in a miracle, there were 100 that ended in blood. He would find out for himself, one way or another. But alchemy was never the work of one man. It was a brotherhood, secret, fragmented, and eternal, a line of transmission that spanned continents, centuries, disasters, and rebirths. For every solitary magus laboring in the dark, 100 more watched and waited for their chance to inherit the spark. It was a relay, a conspiracy, a cryptic family tree. In every city, in every age, the flame passed from hand to hand, always threatened, never extinguished. Laurentius saw this more clearly with each passing year, as the city shifted around him like a puzzle box, never quite settling into solvable shape. He studied the secret lineages of alchemists the way priests studied the lives of saints, mapping their fugitive meetings, their coded correspondences, their heartbreaking failures, and tiny, improbable triumphs. At first, he had imagined that the transmission of secrets would be a grand affair, solemn, ceremonial, like the knighting of a holy order. In reality, it was a matter of desperate improvisation. Manuscripts smuggled in loaves of bread, passwords scrawled in piss on the walls of prison cells, whispered phrases exchanged in marketplaces and brothels. The Brotherhood knew only one law: survive. Everything else was commentary. He tested this theory on his own life as best he could. He haunted the bookstalls along the canal, trading rumors for pamphlets, paying in silver for a single line of dog Latin or a diagram that might, just might, contain a clue. He bribed the sexton at Saint-Eustache to let him into the crypts at dusk, where the real business of the necropolis was conducted. He joined the Workingmen's Guild, then the Beggars' Chapter, and finally, the mole-like fraternity of late-night lamplighters who moved through the city with a caution born of centuries of persecution. Every group had its rituals, its passwords, its secret patron saints. Every one of them was just another branch of the old tree. Sometimes he wondered if the tree itself had a name, or if it was merely a habit of the universe, the way iron always sought the earth. It was in this way that Laurentius first heard of the rose and the cross. At the beginning of the century, strange pamphlets had begun to appear throughout Europe, always unsigned, written in a style at once maddeningly precise and deliriously self-contradictory. They hinted at a hidden fellowship, the Rosicrucians, who claimed to have access to the sum total of human wisdom, passed down through generations by way of symbols. Roses, crosses, circles within circles, stars within stars. The manifestos said nothing directly, but everything obliquely. They claimed to have the cure for all disease, the source of all wealth, the secret of eternal youth, and the blueprint for a just society. They promised nothing less than the rebirth of the world, but in order for this to happen, the world had to recognize its own sickness, the blindness and greed that kept it from its own perfection. The pamphlets spread like a virus. The more the authorities tried to suppress them, the more they multiplied. Laurentius read every one he could find, copying passages into his own coded notebooks, underlining certain sentences until he wore holes in the page. What fascinated him most was not the promises. He had heard them all before, but the way the Rosicrucians described themselves, not as messiahs, but as invisible gardeners. They did not seek power, glory, or even gratitude. They worked in silence, waiting for the world to become worthy of their gifts. They saw themselves as the shadow to the world's substance, the negative image that made the truth visible. Laurentius tried to imagine what such a brotherhood would look like in practice. Did they meet in hidden chambers, masked and anonymous? Or did they pass each other on the street without ever exchanging a word? Did they keep their secrets in books, or in the folds of memory, or in the gestures of the hand and the patterns of the breath? Sometimes, in moments of weakness, he fantasized about being approached by a stranger in a tavern, handed a ciphered letter or a coin with a rose stamped into its face. But the city was not a novel, and Laurentius was neither hero nor villain. The real world was made of smaller, stranger miracles. In time, the legend of the Rosicrucians grew so large that it nearly obscured its object. Squads of informers combed the universities and coffee houses looking for signs of heresy or sedition. Paranoid princes hired cryptographers to break the codes, and theologians to refute them. Some people claimed to have seen the Rosicrucians, or even to have joined them, but every account contradicted every other. In some stories, they lived on the moon. In others, they ran the monasteries or ruled from underground catacombs. The church officially declared them a heresy. But the church was always declaring something a heresy, and nobody listened much anymore. Laurentius believed more and more that the Rosicrucians were not a people, but a pattern, a way of seeing the world that remained after all the evidence had been burned. It did not require a grand master or a secret handshake. It required only the willingness to look at what was forbidden and to keep looking even after everyone else had stopped. He saw now, with a kind of ironic clarity, that this was the real inheritance of alchemy. Not the gold, not the immortality, not the thing itself, but the hunger for the thing. The refusal to accept any world that was not in the process of being transformed. The alchemist looked at the world and saw not a finished product, but a work in progress, a wounded and luminous unfinished thing. The work was never really about curing lead or healing flesh. It was about healing the distance between what was and what should be. The city itself seemed to conspire with this philosophy. Every night, Laurentius wandered its labyrinth of alleys and bridges, his mind simmering with secret formulas, his hands trembling with anticipation and dread. The city was a crucible, a vessel for transformation, a place where the ordinary rules of nature could be bent, if only for a moment, to the will of the initiate. Every street had its ward, its sign, its hidden operator. The old stones remembered more than they revealed. Sometimes, as he walked, he felt the presence of other seekers moving in parallel along invisible lines. A woman in a blue cloak, always just a step ahead of him. A child who watched from behind a window, never blinking. A beggar whose laughter contained the echo of 1,000 lost languages. He understood then that he was not alone, that the brotherhood persisted, even if it never announced itself, even if its members never met. The fire was everywhere, if you knew how to see it. In his rare moments of sleep, Laurentius dreamed of a world in which the secrets had been revealed, and found it not terrifying, but dull. The value of the work was in its incompleteness. Its danger was its beauty. He woke each morning grateful for another day of not knowing, for another day in which the puzzle remained unsolved, the fire unquenched. Still, there were limits to philosophy, and the world was always there to enforce them. For every moment of ecstasy, there were 100 of terror, shame, and bone-deep exhaustion. The price of curiosity was paid in blood, and it was always, always higher than you expected. Laurentius kept his secrets close, but he kept his betrayals closer. The times he had failed to protect an apprentice, the time he had let a friend take the blame for his own experiment gone wrong, the time he had destroyed a rival's notes in a fit of jealousy, only to realize later that he had burned the very proof he needed. He tried to atone in small ways. He left coins in the shoes of the poor. He repaired the broken glass in the south transept of the cathedral. He prayed for the souls of those he had wronged. But the city was a ledger that never balanced, and he knew better than to believe in redemption. All that remained was the work and the hope that it might someday tip the scale in the right direction. That hope never quite died. Even as the world outside grew colder, even as the city filled with spies and informers, even as the brotherhood lost itself in schism and paranoia, Laurentius kept the faith. He studied the pamphlets. He memorized the names and the dates. He built his own laboratory from the wreckage of abandoned dreams. He wrote every day, not for posterity, but for the sake of the writing itself, as if the act alone might conjure a miracle. He watched, with grim fascination, as the old world died and something new began to flicker at its edges. The Renaissance was not the rebirth they had promised. It was something stranger, more ambiguous, a mutation rather than a resurrection. Men who had once burned heretics were now burning books, and sometimes even the books fought back. The lines between science and sorcery, between reason and madness, were dissolving as quickly as the old empires. Laurentius had no illusions about his place in this new order. He would not be a founder or a martyr or even a footnote. He would be, at best, a ghost in the margins. A rumor passed from one initiate to the next.